All right, good morning, everyone. We just celebrate the Lord's Supper today, which is always a wonderful, wonderful time. So, the last couple of weeks we've been having a lot of storms because it's Texas, and that's what we like to do here in Texas in the spring. And a few weeks ago, at one of those storms, I had put my car in the garage, and usually I have my side, Angie has her side. And this time, though, I think she was out of town. She often goes out of town when it's about to storm for some reason. That's just how her schedule aligns with work. And so I parked in her side of the garage, which is the right side. And so I pulled my car in, and the next morning, Aaron had hockey practice early in the morning before school, and so I loaded his stuff in, put him in the car. We're coming out of the driveway, and it's dark. And all of a sudden, as I come down, because we have, just with the slab, right, there's this little, just a little dip, right? And so the car just speeds up just a little bit as we go down. And all of a sudden, I hear this, grinding. And I'm like, what in the world is going on? Because I'm not very good with cars. And if something breaks, that means I can't fix it myself because I don't know anything about them. And so it happened. But then I looked at the little dashboard thing, and there was, no indicator. So I'm like, okay, that's weird. And then it happened again the next day. And I'm like, this is not a good sign. There are things that are going on that I don't know about, right? Well, I happened to figure out that it was because we have our basketball hoop behind us. And so as I came down, it recognized that there was something behind me and I was going a little bit too fast. And so it automatically slammed on the brakes for me. But I didn't know that at the time. And so I'm kind of freaking out about what is going on with my car and why is it making these weird grinding sounds and I'm not even pushing the brake. And it's like, well, you should be pushing the brake. But it kind of, freaked me out because I'm like, man, I don't want to have to take it in because, I don't know anything about cars. When I take them in, I'm usually just like, here, there's something wrong. I don't know what it is. Just go ahead and fix it. And I mentioned before, I'm not very good with building things. I'm not Pastor Brad. I can't make something happen out of just, random pieces of wood. And so for me, a big, big step in my technological savviness was a few years ago when my headlight went out, and I'm like, you know what? I think I can probably fix this, figure out how to do this, right? And if you're here and you're somewhat competent in any type of cars, you're like, of course you can. It's not that hard. But for me, I looked at it like I'm having to construct a full engine. But I'm like, I think I can do this. And so I read the owner's manual, and I got the light, and I opened the hood, and I unscrewed what was supposed to be unscrewed, and I put it back in, and I tried it, and it worked. And it was like one of the happiest times in my life because I'm like, oh my gosh, I can change my car's headlight. And so now when Angie every so often she'll be like, you know what, my headlight's out, can you fix it? And I'm like, I can do that. That is so much easier. But what had appeared super hard and complex to me all of a sudden became very, very simple. And have you ever had that in your life where something that seems complex at first and daunting, as you get into it, you find out that it's actually pretty simple. And you come out the other side and you understand a lot more, and life doesn't seem so hard, right? It might be back when you were in school, or if you're in school right now or college, and you have to take this class, and you're like, man, I do not know how I'm going to get through that subject material. But then maybe you have the right teacher, maybe God just smiles on you a little bit, but all of a sudden you understand what's going on, and you come out the other side, you're like, man, that wasn't so hard. In fact, that's pretty simple. I can teach that to other people. Maybe it was getting married, and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know, how this is all gonna work, and I don't feel, how's it, adulting and having to get a house and all that kind of stuff. But actually, as you go through it, you find it's pretty simple. Or if you hear those words, I'm pregnant, you're like, man, a kid, and now I have to be responsible and, make sure it's fed and alive. And then as you go through it, you're like, oh, I can do another one and another one, And you pretty much find out, oh, I'm not too bad at this, right? Because you get the hang of it, and what has seemed complex you find was actually pretty simple. Well, in the passage that we're looking at today in Mark, at first glance, it seems like there's a lot there, and it seems like it's really, really complex. But once you get the hang of it, it's actually pretty easy. And sometimes it seems like life can be complex, and am I doing things right? In fact, sometimes we ask that question when it comes to our life, right? Because life does seem complex. And so just like we look at a complex scripture and passage, sometimes we're like, man, am I reading that right? Do I understand that right? Sometimes in life, we're like, am I understanding this right? Am I doing this right? And we might phrase it a little bit differently. We might be like, you know what? Am I providing the right opportunities for my kid to be successful? You know, am I spending enough time at work to pay for stuff? Or should I be, maybe you feel guilty about not spending enough time with your kids or your spouse. You know, and so we start to question, like, am I making the right choices in order to get the result that I want to be? Because life can sometimes just seem so complex. And again, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to try and make this complex passage pretty simple, but in doing so, we're also going to make our lives, which often seem complex, simpler. So here we go, and Jesus has, from last week, Jesus has just took on the Pharisees, and they talked about authority, right? And so it's going to continue on. He's still in the temple, and as he taught, Jesus said, watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes. So again, they questioned Jesus' authority, and he's kind of like leveraged a few attacks on them, right? And now he's going to just basically call them out. It says, watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets, but yet they devour widows' houses, those that they're supposed to be watching over and caring for. And for a show, make lengthy prayers. It's like they try and project godliness and righteousness, but they don't have it in their hearts. He says these men, which most of the Jews would look at and hold in high regard, he's like, these men will be punished most severely. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. In fact, in those days, it would be only about 1/64 of a day's wage. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. And so if you remember last week, when they asked him, should we pay taxes to the government or not? And Jesus was like, well, just like this coin has the image of Caesar, and the government provides a lot for you all, so give to the state what is theirs. But then he implied, but who has the image of God? You all do. So give to God what is God's. Let God have you. And so he's showing the disciples that this woman exemplifies that. It's not about the money. And later, he'll talk about Joseph of Arimathea, and he's going to talk about how much wealth that he has. So it's not about the money and that she's giving everything there. It's about, does God have all of you? And does he have all of me? And then we go in chapter 13, and this is going to be what is oftentimes seemingly complex. It says, as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings, because this thing was an amazing sight. Do you see all these great buildings, replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. And then they go back to the Mount of Olives. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled? Now, if you are a good Jewish disciple, or even just a good Jew in this time, there are 2 things that you really care about as far as your identity goes. One is the city of Jerusalem, and the other is the temple, because that's where you came to worship God. That was a sign of his presence with his people. And so to hear that the temple is destroyed conjures up images of the Assyrian invasion and the Babylonian invasion in the past. And so for us today, it might be if someone told you that the White House will soon be destroyed, no stone left on another, you'd know that the country was in deep, deep trouble for that to happen. Things would have gone really bad really, really fast. And so that's the disciples' worry, and that's their question, because now it's affecting who they are and their identity and their families and those they love and care about. So it's just not, this temple is falling down. It has implications for everybody they love and who they are as a nation and people. And so that's their question. They want to know, when is this all going to happen? And Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines, and these are the beginnings of birth pains." Jesus is like, things are going to get bad. Really bad. He's like, there's going to be wars. There's going to be natural disasters. In the midst of that, people are going to come and they're going to claim to be the leader that you've been looking for, that's going to lead everyone through these catastrophes. He's like, they're going to make promises that you want to hear. They're going to tell you things that you want to hear so that you believe them and trust in them. He's like, but don't get sucked into that. And so he tells them what their role is to be. He says, you must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, on account of Christ, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them, and the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given you at that time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Things get so bad that it separates the most intimate, closest relationships. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. He says, everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And now this happened in the early church. Within 40 years, the disciples who he's telling this to will have experienced this. And we tend to think that this is something that is yet to come, but in the early church, this happened. And so they were flogged and they were brought before authorities. And families were split. And so if you read the book of Acts, you see that over and over, but when they're brought before people, they use it as an opportunity to witness, which is kind of crazy to think about, when you're not in that situation. Because we think, man, how would you feel if your the people that you love the most handed you over because they didn't believe you, and now you're undergoing suffering and torture? I mean, that would wreck me. But the early church in Acts is viewing it as they're like, man, it's an opportunity to tell others, to tell those that were brought before about who Christ is. He goes on, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, standing where it does not belong. Now, when you see abomination that causes desolation, that was a phrase that was pretty common and pretty scary to the Jewish audience. That was something that was first mentioned back in the book of Daniel, and it was partially fulfilled by this guy, Epiphanes IV. And what he did was he came in and he basically slaughtered the Jews, a lot of them, and he sacrificed pigs in the temple. So he defiled it pretty horribly. And so they had viewed that as the abomination that causes desolation. But Jesus says there's another one that's going to be coming. And it's going to be partially fulfilled again in a little bit, in just about 40 years after this, when the Zealots revolt and they install a high priest who isn't legitimate. And when that happens, a lot of the people in Jerusalem take off. They flee like crazy because there's something going on in the temple that should not be there. And they know bad things are coming. And Jesus kind of predicts, he says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those days will be days of distress, unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, unless God intervened early, nobody would survive. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. So at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it, for false messiahs, right, false leaders, false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. We're always in danger, even you and I, of being deceived and putting more trust in people sometimes than in God. So be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time. But in those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. He quotes Isaiah. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Son of Man, right? He had just talked previously about who the Son of Man is and the authority that he has. He's like, I am that person. I am the Son of Man. I have all that authority. And in Scripture, when the one comes who's going to gather his people, the scattered people, it's always God. And so here he's equating himself as God, right? Fully God, fully man. But I love this because it's in the midst of darkness and anxiety. That's when the light of God is going to enter with a glorious entrance. And he's like, you won't be able to miss me. So don't wonder if, that leader is the one that we should be following. Don't put your trust in other people. He's like, because when I enter, you're going to know it. But isn't that true how so often for us, it's when things are seemingly going bad and we don't know how things are going to get any worse, and it seems like darkness is kind of enveloping our lives sometimes, and we're filled with anxiousness and worry and not sure how we're going to go on, and it feels like life's falling apart. And it might be something that's happening with your kids. It might be happening with your spouse. It might be happening with you or a family member or and you just can't see how there's actually anything good going on right now because there's so much darkness around you. And it's not just something that you know is there, but you can feel it almost like a weight. But that's often when the light of God appears and when the peace of God arrives. And that's when when the God that we read about in here oftentimes jumps off the pages and into our experiences and into our hearts and our minds as our understanding of who God is, our theology, our knowledge of God, how that goes from head knowledge to what we experience lived out. In my own time, I just started a study on the book of James. Does anybody like James in here? Every time I hear James, I think of Carol. And so I'm doing my own study on the book of James. It was one of the first books of the New Testament that was written, and James was a Jew. Oftentimes viewed as the half-brother of Jesus, leader of the early church in Jerusalem. And so for a lot of people, when they look at James, there's very little theology in James. Because it's all do this and say this and act this way. And so they're like, there's not a lot of theology in James. But they miss that for a Jew, that is their theology. What you say and how you live and how you act, that reveals and is your theology lived out. And so James is heavily theological because it's not about the head knowledge as much as it is about how you're living out your theology. Practicality is the theology. And so we don't understand grace necessarily by reading about grace and the origins of the word and what it means in Greek. We understand grace by doing something dumb and then being shown grace. And we can read about how deep God's grace is for us, but we understand it a whole lot more when we do something even dumber, but yet we're still shown grace. And we can read about love, and we can understand there are 4 different types of love, but we still don't get it as much as when we have a love for someone that we've grown up with, and we view them as a brother. Or we understand love differently when it's intimacy between a husband and a wife. Or the way that we give unconditional love to our kids, or just how we show love to one another. And so that's how we understand theology, and the study of God is in how we live. And so sometimes it's in the midst of darkness, the most heavy darkness, when we see the light of God the most. And so maybe that is you right now. Maybe you're in a dark area. And it could be for any number of reasons. But maybe this is the time when you're going to see God the most. And you're going to understand more of his peace. And although it's a horrible time to be in, it can also be one of the best times to be in. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that the summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now, a lot of what he's just talked about in here does happen in 70 AD. Titus comes in, destroys the temple, leaves one stone not upon another, and yet some of this is still to come. But here's the most important part of what Jesus wants them to understand in this text. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard. Be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house, puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned tasks, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. Jesus is like, I gave you all some info about what it's going to look like, because things are going to get bad, and you ask about when it's all going to happen. But the important question isn't when it's going to happen. He's like, the important question is, what are you going to do in the meantime? Because he knows our human tendency can be that when the boss is out of the office, sometimes you slack off a little bit. And sometimes you show up to work a little bit late, clock out a little bit early, and think, you know what, that report can wait till the next day. We don't have that same urgency. But see, super simple what Jesus is telling his disciples in here. He's like, with all that's coming in, and it's going to be super complex, and it's going to have anxiety and worry and all. He's like, just stay on task. Don't stop. What's our task as disciples? It's pretty easy, right? We even talked about that last week. Love God. Love others. And then he tells us to go and make disciples. Right? That's it. For Jesus, it's not about how much you know, or do you know the Greek or Hebrew or wordy definitions of really long words. He's like, do you love God and love others? And then are you telling others about me? And so do we love God, right? Have we made that decision to give our life to Christ, to entrust him with our eternity and our life right now? Have we said, like, God, all I am is yours, like the widow offering her 1/64th of a day's wage? Do we say to God, like, you alone are the object of my worship? Or have we allowed something else to creep in and to steal our hearts? Do we love others, right? Do you help those who are in need? Are you willing to help anyone just because they're made in the image of God? Even if they believe different things than you. Even if they're a part of a different political party than you believe. Or even a different religion than you believe. Think of a group that you probably wouldn't have anything to do with. Would you help one of them if they were in need? Because if not, then there's a limit to our love. And we probably need God to do some work in our life there. Where he says to make disciples. Again, one of the most common questions that I hear is, how do we get more people to come to church? Doesn't matter if it's this church or any church. They're all asking the same question. How do we get more people to come to church? But it's super easy, right? It's inviting people. But we like to look at other people and say, well, you invite, like, how can we help you invite people? No, it's like, how can I invite people? It's, hey, you're new to the area. If you're looking for a church, we'd love to have you come to this church. Or maybe they've been wrestling with a situation. You're like, you know what? Maybe you should come to our church because I think it might help with what you're going through. At one point in Luke, and we're going to look at it not today, but a different day, Jesus is doing the Lord's Supper. And what does he say about the cup to those present? Right? He says, I'm not going to drink it again until I drink it with you in the kingdom of heaven. So who are you bringing to the kingdom with you? And so you might look at those three things, right? Love God, love others, make disciples. And it might be like, check, I don't know. All right, and there are times maybe when we're doing great at it. There are times when we don't do so well. You're that way, I'm that way. There are times we need to get back on track. And as we do that, though, we grow. And as we do that, we find that sometimes we just have to get uncomfortable. Because when you follow Christ, he does put us in uncomfortable situations, but that's the task that we're given. We think, what are people going to say? Or what are they going to think if I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing? Maybe you feel called, maybe you feel God's calling you to do something for him or to do a ministry. Maybe it's part of the church, maybe it's like your own thing, but it's scary. And so you're like, I feel God is calling me to do this, but what if I fail? And we don't want to be uncomfortable. Well, on Friday, I took Aaron to a skating lesson with a skating coach. And when you're starting to ice skate, you have one goal, right? Not dying. And how do you die in ice skating? You fall down. And so when you first start learning to ice skate, you step on the ice, and your legs are going like crazy, right? And you're just trying to stay up, and your arms are like this. And that's the goal. Don't fall down so you don't die. And so I'm watching this session, and this coach that he's working with, she's got 4 kids. There's 2 AAA players, 2 AA players, and so they're all pretty good. They're all great 10-year-olds. And I love watching these kids, not because of how good they are as skaters. That comes out in the games. But I love watching it because of how often they fail and how often they fall. And I told Aaron a long time ago, I'm like, if you want to be great at skating, You have to love to fall. When you're doing your drills, don't go slow. Go fast. And your skates are going to go from under you, and you're going to crash to the ground, but you keep doing it over and over and over, and guess what? You're going to get faster, and you're going to stay up. Right? Because they're learning how to get farther and farther, right? Your skates have like a little hollow, and so they have to learn how to get on the edge of their skate, right? Like that. And the better they are, the more stable they are, the more fluid they are. It doesn't matter if people are knocking into them, right? They can stay on their skates and they can make tighter turns and do all those kind of things. So if you watch figure skaters, right, they're oftentimes on the edges of their skates. And hockey players look at figure skaters and they're like, man, I want to be as good as that. And so they hire figure skaters to teach them how to play hockey. Why? Because they want to be better on their edges. And so when they were newer skaters, the goal was not to fall. As you develop, you learn that if you want to be great, you've got to fall. And so you watch these kids fall, and it's great because they go fast and they just fly in their fall. But then they get up and they do it again. And they fall and they get up and then they do it again. All right? You have to learn to be willing to be uncomfortable and be willing to take chances and to get on your edges and be willing to fall. And the longer I've been a Christian, the longer I've learned that you have to be willing to take chances and you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. You have to be willing to fall. And then you get up and then you do it again. And as you do it, you don't feel quite as unstable. You feel like you have more stability. Why? Because God is using you and he's developing you. And so it's in the times when God is putting you in an off-balance situation that you see God is doing something in your life. And so maybe that person that you invite to church doesn't come. That's okay. You got on your edges. That's fine. Maybe you spoke a kind word to someone in your life that was having a hard day, and they're like, shut up, I'm going through a hard time. Leave me alone. And you try to show them love, they shut you down. It's okay. You got on your edges. So the disciples did things over and over, right? Falling time after time. Sometimes Jesus would shake his head. He'd just be like, come on, guys. But he kept with them because they were learning. And he knew that he was developing them into the people that the Father had created them to be. See, greatness to God isn't defined by our title or our role. It's by being faithful to what God has given to you and I to do in the meantime. Loving God, loving others, telling people about Christ. And so when we do those things right, being a parent and taking a tough class in school or understanding our relationship with God, those seemingly at times complex things, because of all the choices that are out there, actually become so much easier. Because we're doing the main things right. And we know that if we love God, that's probably going to be spilling over to how we parent our kids. If we love others, we know that we're probably being a better coworker or a better schoolmate. And we're telling other people about who Christ is. We're ultimately helping them have a spot at the table in the kingdom where Christ is going to enjoy that cup of wine with them. Let's pray. God, as we're here this morning, sometimes we get so caught up in the complex and the uncomfortable that it can be easy to almost stop. And we can become rebellious even without even knowing it. But you call us to love others, to love you, tell others about you. And that's the task you've given to your disciples, and that has been passed down to us today. And so I would ask that you help us to get those things back if we've let them go. Help us to be willing to invite more people to know you, whether it's coming to church or just telling them about who you are. Help us to love others who don't believe the same things or maybe just aggravate us day after day. And help us to love you more. Because you are our God. And you are going to enjoy fellowship and time with us in the kingdom of heaven. And we can't wait. So help us to do well in the meantime. In Christ's name, amen.